thing that's been made me at least semi-successful is knowing that I don't know everything and not being afraid to ask.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. All right, so here at NI Week.
NI Connect.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk about that in a second. I'm here with Putnam. He's very well known. He's a fixture in the LabVIEW community. He looks like he's 92, but he is not 92. But he has been doing LabVIEW since 1992. So welcome, Putnam.
I'm happy to be here. I really actually am. Yeah, I got into it, LabVIEW, entirely by accident. I was working for General Electric military, and they wanted to use HP Basic, and I just couldn't see going backwards. And at that precise moment, NI held a little dog and pony show at the Holiday Inn next to where I worked, showing off LabVIEW. That it was LabVIEW 2.5, the first version on the PC. And it also was worked on Sun workstations, and I had a PC and a Sun workstation on my desk. Went over and went, wow, this looks really cool. And then brought the demo copies, which at the time fit on 5 1/4 inch floppies.
Wow. How many 5 1/4 inch floppies?
For the demo? One.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a much smaller footprint.
Yeah. Demo.
But understand that PCs only had, 640K of memory, whatever.
Yeah, so
you couldn't do much bigger than that. And yet, it ran, although the early versions crashed exceedingly frequently with what they called an insane error.
I haven't run into those in years, but when I first started, I used to run into insane objects all the time, and you had to open the heap or something and the leak peep window and figure out which one it was and delete it and recreate it or something.
Well, in our case, we just usually rebooted it and lost whatever it was because they also didn't have autosave. And so I was working with an engineer on one of my first projects, and he even became so superstitious that he wouldn't say, have you saved it? Because if he did, it would crash. So he would say something totally obscure, and I would understand and immediately do a save.
It's like the old habit of hitting Control S all the time.
Yes.
So I was listening to a podcast that they were making fun of that because he's like, I'm on my Google Docs now and I'm constantly hitting Control S, and the guy next to me is like, what the heck are you doing?
My early code, in retrospect, was atrocious. Even National Instruments didn't know how really to code stuff.
The old examples?
The examples were sequence structures were very, very common. And because most of us had come from a regular, text-based linear programming language, that fit into our mental model better. But I found that pretty early on that writing in a graphical language, it felt like it was using a different part of my brain. And I was pretty good at visualizing my text-based code. I could roll my eyes back in my head and kind of figure out which of hundreds of, maybe even thousands of lines of code it might be in when somebody asked me about something. But I just fell in love with the graphical programming, and just, 30 years later.
So I've been thinking about this lately because I've been doing a little bit of Python coding, and nested structures and arrays and clusters and stuff. I have trouble visualizing that in Python. My immediate thought is I want to go draw it up in LabVIEW. Just dropping a cluster and putting a couple things in it and stuff, it helps to organize my thought process, I think.
Well, that's where I trended. I found that I probably am a visual person, because even with my code, I would be visualizing my text-based code. Mm-hmm. But it was much easier to visualize graphical code than lines and lines of code. So I also went way overboard on the first one because I was using a Hewlett-Packard instrument control systems analyzer, which would produce, it was like a digital spectrum analyzer with a signal source that you could put in a programmed signal source and then get the data back. And well, NI said they were going to have drivers for it any day now. I suspect they still haven't. And I started, as the very first LabVIEW project, was one of the things I started doing was writing drivers for this. Mm-hmm. The big mistake was I should have been figuring out what measurements I was making, make the measurements, record, however, manually record what settings and what pieces of the programming set for this instrument. Yeah. But no, I'm making myself
the full-fledged
a full-fledged one. I wrote stuff that never ever got used.
Yeah, I've made the same mistake. You get the manual for the entry, like I'll just write commands for all these, and it's like that's.
And this one had a lot of commands.
Yeah, you're using like 5 commands. So make a driver that just sends the 5 commands you need, and yeah.
But we ultimately were successful, and it was my first one.
Yeah.
And from then, I've made a career. I've lived off of LabVIEW since then. So
at what point did you decide to become a consultant?
Well, I mentioned I had been working for GE when I started with LabVIEW, and I was the first person on GE in the area using LabVIEW, so I became fairly valuable. And then GE sold us to Martin Marietta, and then Martin Marietta bought Lockheed, and so now we're this ginormous corporation, but still everybody and all the people I was dealing with pretty much were former GE. But part of that buyout was they kept shutting down other GE facilities, and I got wind that, well, we'd had a lot of layoffs as well, and I managed to dodge the layoffs because, well, I was the only one that knew LabVIEW. And then we absorbed another facility, and I knew they had a number of LabVIEW people that were actually pretty good. And so I realized that the next round of layoffs, at that precise moment, I had a headhunter call me and ask me if I knew anybody that knew LabVIEW, be interested in a 6-month project at X dollars an hour. And when I got my knee out of the dent that I made in my desk drawer, I said, yes, I do. And I went on an interview that was probably the only interview I've ever had that I didn't actually have to say anything, maybe lie. I actually, and so I went down to my first consulting job that ended up being 3 years, where at the end of 3 years, I told them I had to leave because it was 2.5 hours from home and my kids were growing up, not seeing daddy most of the week.
Yeah.
And the person I reported to at that company put me in contact with somebody else, and we convinced him he needed to have a LabVIEW consultant on staff.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, and then when 9/11 happened, this small company suddenly ran into a horrible cash flow problem, and he said, look, I don't think I can make payroll because all of our customers are hungered down. And that's when I started my own company, and the rest is history. I'm unfortunately a fairly decent engineer and really lousy at marketing. And so my company's never grown past, at one point I had 2 other employees.
Oh, wow.
But other than that, it's been me. And
yeah, I think that's a common challenge with LabVIEW. Well, I think engineering consultants in general. I feel like engineers tend to think I'm a really good engineer and everybody should just know that and hire me anyway. And that sounds great in theory. In practice, it doesn't work out all that well.
Well, part of the problem is as you start your own company, you really do have to have enough money. And part of that money isn't just for keeping your bills paid. It's to hire people to do things that are not necessarily your engineering jobs, like keeping track of all the monies coming in and out. But even more importantly, probably, is somebody that's a really good sales that can go out and market you. But then, of course, you have to have more people because, well, it can only market. I mean, it's really hard to try and find your next job if you're really dedicated to doing the one you're doing right now.
Yeah.
And
this seemed like a perfect time to remind you about the LabVIEW Consultant Summit happening December 14th, 2023. Just like Sam and Putnam were talking about, there's a lot more to running a LabVIEW consultancy than just being a good engineer. We've got plenty of space to talk about all of those things. More information will be in our show notes and also a link to buy tickets.
So I have had periods where I was doing a lot of household maintenance.
Yeah. Well, 2 lessons I learned very early on was, number 1, don't ever commit 100% of your time. Don't ever commit to do 40 hours a week because you need to do time for sales and marketing and doing the books and all that. And the other one is, when you have a really big client, that's when you should be doing the most marketing, because as soon as that ends, you're done.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem I had with marketing and doing all the rest of that was that while I work remote a lot of times on some projects, but that remote is from home. A lot of these projects I served as what I've coined the term staff augmentation.
Yeah.
Where they have a project that's bigger than they have staff, but it's not big enough to justify them actually hiring permanent people.
Yep.
And so those always came with a known end date. But since I'm sitting in a hotel and somewhere in Illinois or somewhere else, I can't really be out pounding the pavement to find the next customer. Now, a lot of my smaller customers have come from one of my biggest competitors, would see a project and decide that the overhead for it, it didn't justify them taking it, but they knew I had a smaller overhead, so they would send it to me. So got some very interesting projects that way.
Yeah, I think they've sent me 1 or 2 jobs as well over the years. And that's one thing I like about the LabVIEW community, at least the consultant community. I feel like it's not generally very cutthroat or anything. Everybody,
there may be people. I mean, I don't deal with those larger.
Yeah.
But on the level I'm on and a little higher, I have absolutely no problem if I'm busy.
Yep.
Or it's something I'm not really interested in doing, or it's someplace I'm not interested in doing it in.
Yeah.
And I know of somebody that's looking for work, I'll be more than happy. And a guy that I met on one of these contracts, who turned out, I didn't know him until I met him out in Utah, lives across the lake I live on. He just lives, he lives back where I live.
Yeah.
And we ran into each other in Utah. I mean, recently he got a project that I looked at, decided not to take, and now regret not having taken it because it actually worked out to be what they said it was going to be, which is 1 day a week or less on site. But he's run into problems with it because he's dealing with somebody's legacy code and trying to even get, so much of the stuff that we've used over the years that was on the NI websites disappeared. It's been deprecated.
Yeah.
And even getting an older version of LabVIEW becomes problematic for him. So he and I did what would have looked like a espionage thing, with me handing him a thumb drive in a parking lot halfway between our houses with LabVIEW 2019 on it. He has his license, but he didn't have the actual. He actually didn't have the code. So.
Oh, that's interesting.
But. Yeah, it's one of the things I've enjoyed about the community is that, well, our forums, for instance, you post a problem there and not every answer is correct, but an awful lot of people try and help. And in fact, on occasions when I've run into problems that I just cannot figure out, I have posted on there, and I've even told my customers I'm going to post on there, and I'm leaving their facility at 5 in the evening, and they're like, well, and I go, well, if I called NI right now, I wouldn't get anybody.
Yeah.
And if I did, it would be a lower level person that would have to escalate it. I said, I'll put it on this forum, and there will be people I know waking up in Australia to go on and look at the forum, and some of these people are as smarter than I am. And so the community has, I'm a nerd, and I have bad social skills, but this is a community I seem to fit a little bit into.
Yeah, I think a lot of us feel that way.
That I'm a nerd and have bad social skills?
Both that and about ourselves.
But I've enjoyed it. You know, my sweetie keeps telling people I'm retired. I'm saying I'm semi-retired because I keep getting work.
Yeah.
I'm not terribly active doing it, but I'm reluctant to stop because I enjoy the community. I enjoy the projects I get, and I enjoy working in LabVIEW.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I kind of want to revisit something you said earlier about doing staff augmentation versus doing more of a consulting role. Is most of the stuff you do staff augmentation?
It's probably a 50% mix. Okay. I mean, I get projects where I am the only person. I'm sitting either in their facility, explaining to them why they shouldn't have bought this hardware without talking to somebody first, or specifying the hardware for them and helping them order it and, putting it together. Or one of my recent ones was for a very large defense contractor where I walked in, and I don't think, other than NI Week, I've been in a place that had as many LabVIEW programmers.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a whole group of people doing tests. They had the engineers that were writing the original concept of what LabVIEW is for. Engineer writing a little snippet to test some little thing of the circuit they were building. It wasn't going to be any long-term tests. It was just make measurements to confirm or deny, whatever they were doing. But it's all over the map. I mean, my very first consulting job, I came in, and for whatever reason, they had decided they needed LabVIEW. They wanted to do it in LabVIEW. And I was essentially their first contractor, and by the time I left there, they had a number of staff LabVIEW programmers, but they also had probably 25. A lot of people that for instance, Dan Press, it's going to be.
Yeah.
He was one of the young guys in that team, and there's been a bunch of other ones that have crossed paths here. Some went off and did real well with starting their own companies. So, but that was just so enjoyable going from where I was, where the only reason I kept my job was because nobody else knew LabVIEW, to actually being in a place where other people appreciated LabVIEW and acknowledged that maybe I had some worth.
Yeah.
LabVIEW been very, very good to me.
So do you do any hardware stuff or just software?
Well, you mean design hardware?
Well, I mean,
I put together test systems. Sometimes I just write software. Sometimes I spec out all the instruments they need, and even have, on occasion, designed interfaces to talk to whatever weird stuff they happen to have. And I mean, I've tested wind tunnels. I've tested wind tunnels for testing filters. One of the projects, my more recent, bigger, long-term projects, was with a small research company I'm not entirely clear exactly. They do make some medical research type equipment, and it ended up with me working with their one engineer designing this whole thing that was basically the operator takes a sample of whatever it is with this little thing that looks like a stylus, turns around, clips it into this thing, closes the door, it plunges into liquid nitrogen, puts that sample into a little pocket and a specimen holder, rotates to the next specimen holder, brings the stylus back up, can repeat. And so I was doing the motion control, another case where they just picked some hardware that I wouldn't have necessarily chosen, but it was running equipment to control the level of the nitrogen as it evaporated, motion controlled, and rotate these test things into position, making measurements of temperatures, et cetera, to keep track of all of that. Yeah. So it was, he and I co-worked together on all this mechanical stuff, including going back to the motion control people and telling them things that weren't the way they told us they were, and so they might want to update their documentation. So yes, I've my very first in LabVIEW was when I was working for GE. I was definitely designing interface stuff because we were designing the thing that those particular ones were in the design phase of engineering. So I was working with the design engineer that was designing the circuit of the thing we were going to test, but I had to design the stuff to interface with it.
So I'm curious, over the years, what is the biggest improvement to LabVIEW that you've seen over the years, as far as like they've added a bunch of features and stuff? What would you rank as the biggest, or which one had the most impact on you?
Wow, autosave.
Autosave? Yeah, that's a big one.
That one's saved me on many occasions, but it's really hard to say. I mean,
control references, I would say, would be a big one.
Yeah,
I just know because I inherited a program that had 24 graphs, and every time you wanted to set the visibility on all of them, you had a for loop with 24 property nodes.
No, that would definitely. I mean, I can't. It's a hard time to single out one because it's been incremental over so many years, and some of them I'm like, why'd they do this? But other ones like, oh yeah, wow, I wish they'd done this a long time ago. And like you say, well, okay, probably the biggest is that now it know that you're clicking. You know, I'm having a little syntax error here. Events. Yeah, I found it. I found the word.
Yeah.
Events, because I've been doing it back when if you wanted a user interface, you basically ran a loop that polls the state of every control.
Yeah, and you bundled them together, and then you determined which one changed, and then...
And so having events where you suddenly could do things in a much, much slicker fashion.
Yeah, much more responsive and much easier to...
Well, that's the other thing is when you're polling, particularly with earlier versions of Windows, if the operator jiggled the mouse, it would do one of these, and you might miss that momentary.
Oh, wow!
I mean, it wasn't pretty, but we made it work.
Yeah. So, what do you think of the newer frameworks and stuff that come out, like DQMH and Active Framework and stuff? Do you still use those, or you still do like the old producer consumer, or do you have some other architecture?
I do both. I mean, I've been, with a couple of projects, I've toyed with them, but some of the projects haven't justified them because they're not big enough, and I'm not going to do them again.
Yeah.
Some of those things I really see as things that are really beneficial if this is going to be the architecture for your projects for the future. But since I have absolutely no clue what the next project's going to look like, I mean, some of them it would be using a nuke to take out a cockroach. I mean, it would be way overkill.
Yeah.
But I can't say I'm an expert on any of the, an actor or DQMH. I do know the experts on it.
Well, that's the important part.
I think that's been probably the thing that's been made me at least semi-successful is knowing that I don't know everything and not being afraid to ask. I mean, there's no way you can know everything, and particularly in this universe, the way it's going. And there are people out there. I mean, I haven't done a beta testing recently, but I used to be fairly active in doing beta testing. And some of the things that people would find is like, what were you doing that you actually ever found that in the first place? So like such a corner case that I can't imagine how they tripped over it in the first place.
The biggest one for that, I think, is Weeby. I think he goes out of his way to try to find things. Weeby?
Yes.
Yeah, he's like, I put a slash, whatever, some special character in this string thing, and it crashed. And you're like, why would you think to do that?
I know. I mean, I'm
good
really
for him.
happy.
I mean, I'm glad he's out doing it, but yeah.
But I mean, I would be just, hammering it with things that were similar to stuff that I had done. And occasionally I might find something. And in fact, I don't remember which LabVIEW version, one of the first, it was the LabVIEW 6 or somewhere around there. They had a little scroll thing of naming the people whose contributions, and I had one. I can't even remember what it was. But there was one. I was so proud of myself. I was like, wow, I guess I've achieved some fame in the LabVIEW community because my name is mentioned when you install it. Similarly, the Boolean constants on the diagram page, the current ones are Christian Altenbach's.
Yeah. As opposed to the toggle.
The ones that look like slide switches.
Yeah.
For.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it told you what it was, but it took up a lot of real estate.
I don't know. I'm not actually a fan of having those because partly what happens is I click on it to move it and I end up toggling it and not realizing. I don't know if anybody else has that problem. I wish there was like a box around it that you could click on to move it without actually toggling it.
I mean,
It's me.
I think events probably would be the thing that's the most significant to me.
Not the auto tool or quick drop or. Are you an auto tool person or you still do the tab thing?
I have done projects where I've done it. Yeah. And I was down here for an NI week and had the developer of it tell me, we just have to sit on your left hand. So you can't do that. But the thing is that was one of the problems I had when they went to, was it 5 to 6? They rearranged everything in the palette.
Oh.
And I went on the forum to whine about it. It might even been before the forum. It might have been back when we were doing the pre-forum stuff. But I said, I know it works, but I've got a muscle memory, where I can just go through and I don't have to think about it. I just know to go to and click, And I said, it's like you go to bed at night and somebody sneaks in your house and rearranges all your furniture, and you get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and you trip over your couch. The couch is still there. Everything's still there, but it's not where you left it. And it was really funny because Greg McCaskill, who was, I'm good because I've been doing this for a long time. I'm going to name drop when I possibly can.
Yeah, I know that name.
Greg McCaskill, who was one of the original team locked up to create LabVIEW in the first place, was still pretty active answering forum questions or lurking in the background if not an answer didn't come up. And I was at NI week, and it was at the very last day, and I'm walking into the men's room, and I hear this voice behind me saying, yeah, well, I remember what it was he came on the forum and kind of slapped me down a little bit for my whining. Whereupon I saw that just before I had a big meeting at that very first consulting gig. And I went in and went, I was just slapped down by Greg McCaskill. Like it was this badge of honor. And when I ran into him at NI week, at the very last day, I hear this voice behind me. I wasn't slapping you down. It's like they changed things. And that was when I got my first CLD. When I went to take the test, I had discovered that with this new version, you could set it up as layout, the old style layout.
Oh, wow.
Which made it, so I wasn't going to, because you're time constrained.
Yep.
And you don't need anything to time constrain you. And one of my friends that I was working with that was a very good LabVIEW programmer didn't pass because he had never encountered that, didn't know that you could go in and fairly quickly at the beginning before you did anything else, change the settings so that all the palettes would be the same. So when they do that, I have muscle memory. I go in there and I'm thinking about what I'm working on, not trying to find something. As soon as I break my train, then sometimes these wonderful, brilliant ideas I have just vaporize.
Disappear, yeah.
Then again, sometimes the next morning, after 3 o'clock in the morning, finding this beautiful answer to something and fixing it or creating something, I wake up and go, oh, that was bad.
Yeah, I don't know. I was a late adopter on the auto tool because I think I started right when it came out, and the guy who was my mentor at the time, he hated it, and so I learned how to tab really quickly, and then eventually I just gave in, and it works pretty well. But then recently the switch to higher density, pixel density monitors made it much harder because now the spot you have to hover got much smaller, and it's kind of a pain.
Yeah, the old, 640 by 480 monitors, you didn't have really. That was when people used to have diagrams that you scrolled and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. Yeah. Some still do.
Yeah.
But now you can put a lot of density on one screen. So.
Yeah, also Quick Drop, I was a little bit of a late adapter to that. At first I thought I saw people coding, they were coding super quick. And I was like, my brain doesn't work that quick. I need to stop and think about what I'm doing. Yep. But what I eventually realized was that it actually gave me more time to think because I spent less time hunting for stuff in the palettes, and it was much easier to just automate that one thing. So it's interesting.
Well, as long as the palettes don't get moved. I don't
They
have
do
to
that
look.
quite a bit.
I
now.
know.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know why they do that.
And then you add some new, tool palette from one of the outside ones.
JKI or something. Yeah.
Seems like,
stuff.
Where is it?
Yeah, that too. Trying to find things. Well, the one problem I have with Quick Drop is it's hard. Like the things that I don't use all the time, I don't always know the name.
Yes, exactly.
Like the common ones, I learned the little shortcuts, and that's easy. But
Well, that's it, because quite frequently I know what kind of function it is, so that gets me into one
into the palette, yeah, you're like,
and then I know sort of what I'm supposed to be doing with it. But remembering the name, well,
yeah, that's I've gotten better at that. So I wanted to ask you, you mentioned legacy code earlier. You've probably inherited a lot of that over the years. Do you have any tips for dealing with legacy code?
try and go through the code, if you can actually even look at the code. Go through the code and try and block out what the designer was trying to do, as you think they, try and visualize what they were trying to do. And then in some cases, just, once you've got a comfortable grasp on what you think they were trying to do, and sometimes it's a matter of understanding the device you're actually trying to test and seeing what they were doing. Then a lot of times it's just going to be taking chunks and changing it. On the other hand, sometimes you walk into legacy code and you just basically say, yeah, I have a diagram somewhere that I went into a customer and I was actually going to quote them stuff, and they gave me the code to look at, and I had fixed it pretty much initial fix before the meeting was over. Just looking at it, I was just, I couldn't, my compulsiveness wouldn't let me. But there was, then they gave me the second part of it, and it was a screen that scrolled 2 screens each way, and they were all black icons.
Oh.
With wires leading everywhere.
Yeah, and probably like, the full connector pane full on each one and a bunch of unrelated things.
It was one of the most horrific I've ever looked at. And I looked to see how's this thing actually supposed to be tested, and it would faster for me to do it than to try and fix it. So.
Well, you'll appreciate the first project I inherited had the main VI was sequence structure was 18 deep, or actually 19 deep, because they needed the first 17 to initialize all the global variables correctly in the correct order. And then frame 17 did the actual stuff, and then the last one.
And as long as they didn't write to those global variables after this.
Yeah, well, I just talked to Norm about debug developing. This thing had a set of debug flags that had a giant global variable with debug flags that you could toggle at any point during the program. You entered some special thing, and it popped up the global variable window, and you could just change whatever you wanted. That was really interesting.
I have seen a lot of very interesting.
Yeah, that was a very interesting thing, because the first thing my boss did was send me to LabVIEW Core 1 and Core 2. And of course, LabVIEW Core 1, Core 2, very dogmatic, teach you all these rules and stuff. And I came back and the code broke every single rule. And my boss is like, yeah, this guy's world-class LabVIEW developer because he made this thing work. And I'm like, I don't know about that. But
well, one of the problems I've run into is I've gone into places that had people that were writing code in LabVIEW. And some of them had taken the Core 1, Core 2. But the problem is that a lot of companies, you take the Core 1, Core 2, then it's 6 months before you ever get to use it, and they've forgotten everything.
But in the company's mind, you're still the expert.
Yes.
You know everything now because you took the class.
I went into one, and I was there basically to support them and then write some code for them for other tests. I'm not going to fault them. They're not LabVIEW programmers.
Yeah.
They were these test engineers doing other stuff that were required to do some LabVIEW. And the LabVIEW, one of the guys had one of these ginormously deep sequence structures.
Yep.
The tester had run for years.
Well, see what amazes me? Yeah.
Every so often it would hiccup, but mostly it was just run. But they needed some additions to it for data gathering and stuff.
That dramatically changed the architecture.
Well, I went in and changed the architecture, and I'm very gentle. I'm not going to, I've got 30 years of experience. There are people out there that are way better than I am.
Yeah. But yeah, when you're in the house of cards, though, you can't be a bull at a china shop and just start knocking stuff around because it'll all collapse on you.
But, well, I just am, I recognize the fact that these people haven't made their life in LabVIEW.
Yeah.
They were told this is a tool you're going to use, and so use it. So they did to the best of their ability, and they didn't have the time or incentive to become more knowledgeable about it. They got the job done.
Yep.
Which
you can't knock them for that. I mean,
no, I don't.
That's what they're going to do.
You know,
solve the problem.
like I said, this particular test thing, we made changes to software because we were having to replace hardware that had worn out physically, mechanical hardware that had worn out.
Well, it's weird because that project that I had with all the global variables and stuff, on some levels, I'm amazed because like it would have problems and the guy would know exactly where to look. And I don't know how he kept that whole model in his head because it was just like way over my head. Like I would have to hunt around forever to try to figure out what was going on. So there is some kind of genius there.
Well, and that's the other aspect of legacy code is trying to trace, trying to figure out what's going on when it's actually running, trying to probe it, in the early days, I have seen LabVIEW code that if you put a probe on it, it slowed LabVIEW down, microseconds probably, but it was enough that all of a sudden it wouldn't fail.
The race conditions and stuff.
Wouldn't fail. It's like, I had a program I wrote that caused me to pull large patches of hair out in the middle of the night in Illinois. And one of the ones that I went online and to the forums and posted, it was a condition where basically LabVIEW executed so fast that when I set something here, the hardware reacted almost instantly, and by the time I went to look at the response, it was gone.
Wow.
That's how I'm remembering it. And it took me a while to figure out because then when I tried to, when I put it into debug mode, it worked.
Slow down, yeah.
I'm like, that's the first clue. It's
Well, the other interesting thing I found with legacy code is sometimes, like, you mentioned trying to understand what they intended to do, but sometimes what matters is not what they intended to do, but what it actually does.
Yes.
Right? Because somehow, especially if it actually works, right? Like there's some weird race condition in there that they didn't intend, but it somehow manages to work, and you're like, wait. And then if you go change it, now all of a sudden it doesn't work the way it worked before.
Well, yes, it doesn't work the way it worked before, and sometimes you have to convince your client that the answer you're getting is actually the correct answer.
Or that the answer that they thought was the correct answer is actually now the wrong answer, right? Yeah.
Well, I've run into that first client. We worked in conjunction with HP on a $7 million tester to test fiber optic component. And when we got it completed back at our facility and we fired it up, we were getting failures all the time.
Yeah.
And it turned out it's because the device that they had developed, was real cutting edge and they didn't really understand it.
Yeah.
And it ended up with two of their photonics scientists presenting papers at some prestigious thing about this phenomena, and that tester never got used. We ended up using the hardware for something else down the road. So,
yeah, I think it was Steve was telling something about like, they replaced this test and the old one was failing like 3% and their new one was failing like 50%. And they're like, oh, this can't be right. And they realized that 50% should have been failing all along.
That's a pretty gut-wrenching realization too, because it means there's a lot of shipped product that hopefully is not something critical to keeping a plane in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the stuff that we do sometimes can be very impactful.
All the time. That's why one of the reasons I don't do medical.
Yeah.
I just, I made the comment about that sometimes, you get this brilliant idea at 3 a.m. while you're exhausted, and sometimes it really is. Sometimes the clarity of thought suddenly, all the rest is stripped away. But unlike a surgeon, when I get up the next day, if it was crap, I can redo it. So.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I try to do mostly commercial goods stuff, because like you said, there's much less. Although I am working right now with a place that makes climbing gear, so that's something you want to get right.
Yeah, well, I want to get all of my stuff right.
Yeah.
Some of it has a more immediate catastrophic result.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff I'm testing is going to have other tests as well.
Yep.
And when it goes into the final whatever,
The final things.
the final thing will work or not work depending on all of the other pieces. I don't want mine to be something that's absolutely critical, life and death.
Yeah. Yeah, well, hopefully, like, they've got that defense in depth thing, too. So, like, if something happens that whatever tester you design happens to miss something, hopefully something else catches it before it makes it out.
But not every place does it, and not every place does it well. Some places are really good about multiple layers, redundancy to make sure that what they're delivering is.
Yeah.
And some are like, test it and ship it.
Well, that redundancy has a cost, right? So, like, I think, like, from a business decision, right? Like, if you're making a commercial device, like a consumer device, you're making pens. What's the worst thing that could happen if you're making pens and one doesn't work? You lose a few bucks, right? Nobody's life is depending on that.
Yeah, I mean,
other things.
I have, when I graduated from Syracuse University, they had this thing that's called the obligation of the engineer, and it's sort of like the Hippocratic oath for doctors. Yeah. And basically it's insisting that when we see something that's wrong, if management's trying to do something and we know this is incorrect from an engineering point of view, particularly if it risks safety for society, we're supposed to push back. And that's easier said than done in some companies.
Well, I was going to say that doesn't always work, right? Because if you look at, they had a thing on Netflix about the Challenger disaster. Is that the one?
Yes.
With the O-rings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
Those engineers totally knew, and they totally said something, and it's still...
But they did what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
You can only, it originated in Canada, basically, and it was a result of a bridge falling down because corners were cut while they were constructed.
Is that the one that oscillated,
no,
the resonance frequency thing?
No, this went up on the St. Lawrence River that collapsed back in the early 1900s with great loss of life while it was being constructed.
Wow.
And it was determined that management that calculations had not been up to snuff and all. And that urban legend is that at least the initial rings in Canada were made from the steel of this bridge.
Oh.
So if you're up in Canada and you see an engineer with a pinky ring, that's what it's for.
Wow.
Down here, ours are stainless steel to show the purity of our intent.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
But no, through my career, and that's one of the best things about having been a consultant, is that I get to pick and choose.
Yeah.
There have been projects I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. There's other projects I've taken that weren't as lucrative as they probably should have been, but because, they were kind of fun and cool.
Yeah. Well, I think, you just said a challenge of when manager is pushing you to do something that's unsafe, but I feel like it's challenging because as engineers too, sometimes we want to over-engineer things, right? We want to give them this big gold-plated solution when the silver-plated one is sufficient.
Yes.
So
understanding the sufficiency rather than the...
Yeah.
Yes, without a doubt. I mean, I have, without a doubt, been guilty of sometimes over-engineering things just because, man, if I do this and if I do that, and I can do this as well.
Yeah.
But, yeah, at some point, you got to say, okay, when is it good enough?
Yeah.
Not when it's the best, but when is it good enough? So...
Yeah, there definitely is a line. That's one of the things I like about the agile kind of methodology. I don't know if you're into that at all, but delivering something and then gradually building on it, and then it kind of avoids that over engineering versus going off and trying to design the perfect solution up front and then trying to build that.
Well, the trying to design the perfect solution up front requires someone to really make a whole lot of upfront decisions.
Yeah, and that usually doesn't happen.
That as you're evolving through the course of the project, you may find that you made assumptions based on the wrong data. Yes, I have worked in that big defense contractor that had so many LabVIEW programmers. We did our agile.
Yeah.
But in other cases, it's just me.
So have you noticed a big change in that over the years of customers moving towards that more agile approach, or are a lot of them still stuck in the old?
Well, it's a problem when you ask that. the customers I've seen that are using it are the bigger ones, and I haven't had a ton of those. And my smaller customers, agile to them is being able to jump up 2 stairs on 1 foot. They're agile.
Yeah.
They're. I mean, a lot of my customers actually have very little understanding. They just know that they need to use software and to automate making measurements because they're getting to building stuff now that their test technicians can't make the measurements fast enough or whatever, or it's not efficient. And they have no idea about the development. They have actually no interest in it. The development should be transparent. They just want
it's just a
product. They want something at the end that does what they need it to do. And then I come in and try and understand what it is they need to do. And sometimes it's actually helping them understand what needs to be done. Because I have another aspect of this over complexity is in manufacturing, you've got design verification, and then you have manufacturing testing. Design verification may be doing all kinds of measurements with the device being stimulated over a wide range of stimuli to prove that the design of the circuit is as they thought it was. Whereas manufacturing is, a lot of times it's just, did they put the right resistors in the right spot and are the diodes the right way around and that sort of stuff. So you don't need to hit it with
the design's
all the way from 0 to infinity and all the rest of that. And sometimes getting the management to understand that. And I go, well, yes, if we do that, your test's going to take 2.5 hours.
For every circuit board, yeah. And then you're everything's backing up and machines are sitting idle.
And you won't really have any more information than you do if you do this other test. It'll only take you 2 minutes because if the design is correct, and you should verify that before we start manufacturing, and if the design is correct, then we're looking to make sure that the components are working.
And maybe like the most basic functional test, like a little smoke test, turn it on. Do you do that?
Well, I mean, that's part of it. Yeah. But I mean, sometimes it's just a matter of making sure the right capacitors got put in the right spots and the right resistors. And
well, you'd be amazed. Like I used to think when I worked at Westinghouse, I would design circuit boards and you'd think you send it out, it would come back and it would be right. But like I've had lots of missing resistors, like you said, missing components put in backwards, traces missing that just don't match the drawings.
The vias that aren't,
or that aren't connected. Like they drilled the hole, but they never plated it. I've had those a few times.
Oh yeah,
that's where just like a simple happy path smoke test usually catches a lot of those errors, or like a visual inspection thing where you just is everything populated correctly.
Well, one of my most problematic projects I did a number of years ago. The company I was working with, who's very smart, but they just decided to call in this outside consulting company to build their actual test rack. They built it from a sketch that I made, and it was just a sketch. I didn't draw up a test rack. I just drew and when it came back, it looked beautiful. The wires were all routed neatly. They were bundled and this and that, and we started running the tests, and I was getting these weird glitches. That I would suddenly get this data, and the device under test would kind of cross its eyes and go into a coma. And troubleshooting that, I really pulled a lot of hair out. And it turned out that this device under test had inputs that were RF, USB, and a bunch of others. Well, the USB on this test rack, they brought it in through an industrial USB connector in the back. And then what I didn't realize is that they split the wire.
They routed the cable.
They split the wires apart in the USB cable and ran them in this nice cable bundle that also happened to have
high-speed power or something.
Well, it had a big RF relays power. So every time I hit that relay to switch the antenna inputs,
you got a bunch
of noise. A big glitch on their line. But trying to find it took me a little while. Wow. Yes. And it's like, and all of my customers saw was how long it was taking me to get my program to work. And it's like,
yeah. No, there are some things that are like hardware problems that you can't solve with software. Like, for example, like making sure you have the right sampling rate and like your instruments are capable of sampling at the right rate.
Well, the thing that's funny from my point of view is that
bit width.
the project before I got into LabVIEW, prior to that, I was a hardware guy.
Uh-huh.
And I got pulled into this side of my test engineering group, and I wrote this ginormous program that worked pretty neat in Pascal,
Ah.
Turbo
I
Pascal.
actually learned Pascal back in high school, so.
And I had cool FFT graphs and everything. Boy, when I found LabVIEW and the graphs were just, you dropped a graph.
Yeah,
fired it
it's
up,
so much easier.
Oh.
Yeah.
In Pascal, you had to draw the box that the graph was in. You had to draw all this, everything you had to do yourself. And yes, you could create tools that you were going to use later, and but so when I got into LabVIEW, but I've run into friends of mine a number of years later that found out that I was making most of my living writing software when I used to kind of mock out the programmers, test engineer programmers. Now I had become one. But yeah, I mean, my degree's in electrical engineering, and much of my work has been actual physical wires as opposed to virtual wires.
Yeah. I'm similar. I have an electrical engineering degree, and I don't do much electrical engineering. I do a little bit. The signal stuff comes in very handy.
Yeah.
That for sure. But yeah.
Well, my background also was I was station engineer for 2 commercial radio stations in the Syracuse area for a while, and I've been a nerd for my whole life. Technology's intrigued me, and you'll pay me to do this? Hey, cool.
Yeah. So I always like to ask people a question. Tell me about an experiment that you tried that didn't work out the way you thought it would, and what did you learn from that?
Well, I touched on the one where the timing of my code that LabVIEW executed faster than the hardware that it was trying to talk to. And that taught me, after a lot of grief and calls home to my beloved, telling her I think I'm in the wrong business. Having been in it at that point for only about 12 years.
Yeah.
What am I doing here? But one, I did solve the problem, which told me that, well, I can persevere. And 2, to be careful about hardware versus software timings. It technically would be sort of a race condition.
Uh-huh.
It's just not a software race condition. This was a hardware versus software race condition. There had been a lot of that over the years, and it's hard to single out one, And that's probably what it is, because as much anguish as I was feeling when I found the answer, oh man, it was like this major rush. It was like shooting some beautiful drug into my veins. It just suddenly there was this clarity, and it's like, oh, the brain still works. I'll drink to that. No, I think that probably, and that I really made the right move totally by accident to get into graphical programming.
Yeah. Any last minute advice for any aspiring LabVIEW developers, consultants?
That's a touchy subject.
Words of wisdom.
We've discussed this. It's a touchy subject, Even a few years ago, I would have encouraged anybody to, but it's murky water now. And it's not just because of NI and all. The whole software industry is murky now. There are changes afoot that trying to get my head wrapped around, but give it a shot. I didn't start my career in LabVIEW.
Yeah. Well, I think too, sometimes people have this idea that you have to have it all figured out before you step foot out, and nobody really does. Nobody has a clue what they're getting into. So if you have the inclination to do it, jump. There is water in the pool.
There is
be
water
all right.
in the pool. Don't go in head first.
Yeah, definitely go feet first.
Feet first.
Yeah, maybe shallow water, but there is water in the pool.
And in actuality, there is a whole lot more work in LabVIEW right now than when I started.
Yeah.
When I was, I've said LabVIEW to people that aren't involved in our industry at all, and they've heard of it.
Yep.
And they actually have demonstrated they were heard of it because they said, well, isn't that weird graphical language? Yeah. I go, yeah, that's it. Whereas back when I started, well, I was working in a facility with 5,000 people, and I was the only person that knew LabVIEW.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting times because I feel like NI has kind of pulled back from the academic market and stuff, so there's not a lot of new people coming in, which is bad if you're a company looking for people, but if you're inclined to go learn LabVIEW, that's good for you. So there's plenty of opportunity because the number of LabVIEW jobs hasn't really changed dramatically.
Yeah, but the inclination to try LabVIEW
Is not
going to. How is someone going to stumble on that?
Yeah.
First of all, it's not like Python where you can download it for free, and well, you can sort of, but it's a lot more effort.
Yep.
That really, one of the things that was really cool, and I contributed to it when I got involved in LabVIEW. I was actually taking courses at Syracuse University, and I took a whole bunch of those blue LabVIEW demos up there and passed them around, and gave them to the people that were teaching the lab courses and everything else. And I didn't follow up to find out if I had any impact, but I figured it might have.
Yeah.
That first consulting project, a lot of the people I worked with, the young men and women that I work with, their first exposure was at school.
Yeah.
And they did projects at school, and it kind of got them hooked. And so when at LabVIEW, they saw a job that said, "Oh, you need LabVIEW knowledge," and it was easy for them to get it because there weren't that many out there. But I mean, I don't want to dissuade anybody. I love LabVIEW. I just, as a long-term solution, who knows?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat, but I certainly hope that things turn around, and I recognize what a great community they've built, because they spend a lot of time and energy and effort building the community, and I think it's still here.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can keep it going.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
100%.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, Putnam. It's been great talking to you.
This has been very...
I could talk more, but...
Yeah, well, we can after.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Yeah. All right.
Well, I got to rehash several stories that you've heard bits and pieces of, and probably everybody that have ever met me and talked about LabVIEW has heard, but I've enjoyed LabVIEW, and I enjoy the community. I like the people I work with, even though I come to this event because most of you are just either names on a forum or faces on a virtual, Zoom call. And those are great too, but I like actually meeting the people.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I Connect, the guy right this time, is all about the people and connecting. So in that sense, maybe it's a good name. So.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment.